Alright, good day. We're going to pick up where we left off on the last in-class lecture. Excuse me. But I'm going to go back just a little bit. Before we get to that, my apologies for shooting in my house, but quite honestly, it's comfortable. So, we're going to go back to talk about steps in international markets. And we'll be starting with the slides if you want to follow along with the slides or want to open them up in another window. We're going to be looking at the PowerPoint slides starting back with table 3-2, steps in entering international markets. Now remember, there are several steps here. First of all, what we're looking at, excuse me, is identifying exportable products. This may sound like a Homer Simpson moment that everyone should understand this, but you would be surprised again at the products that some people would think would be exportable to other countries, cultures, other regions of the world when in fact they haven't done their homework. So you must identify, as it says, key selling features and needs that they satisfy. This is the same from a micro level to the macro level. It's the same concept. If you have a product that doesn't satisfy any needs and or wants, you have precious little hope of that working. Once those exportable products are identified, then you need to look at key foreign markets. Understand the markets for the products. Understand where it will sell, where it won't sell, where you have a good idea that it will sell, or where you have perhaps a questionable idea that it will sell. In other words, determine who the customers are. And of course, again, same concept from the micro level up to the macro level, determining who your customers are. That should be a constant investigation, for lack of a better term, for your organization. That should start long before day one of opening an organization. It should continue to the very end in a successful organization. Next, you're looking at analyzing how to sell and in each of those priority markets. In other words, methods will be affected by product characteristics and also unique features of the country and the market. Remember, we talked about different demographics. Different areas have different demographics. Talking about cultural ideas. Again, we looked at the idea that, for example, in India, where cattle are presumed to be holy or untouchable, if you will, you're not going to go into a McDonald's, if any exist in there, which we already have discovered they do, and order a double quarter pounder with cheese and expect the same double quarter pounder of cheese that you would expect in Muncie, Indiana. It simply won't be the case. Not that it won't have quality, not that it won't perhaps be an equitable price, but it simply won't be of the same material due to the culture and the nature of the market itself. Now, of course, after this happens, you need to understand setting the prices. Setting the prices that not, of course, only cover your fixed expenses and your operating expenses, but setting prices that look to be those ideas that will hopefully help you gain a profit, at least, if not in the first year to 3 years, at least after that. Uh, the idea again is if you don't understand where you need to go to set those levels to make that profit, or you don't see any way to do that, quite honestly, perhaps you need to look at a different type of business. Then estimate the resource requirements and returns. In other words, estimate the resource requirements that you will need. What kind of return are you going to get on those resources? Again, looking at the idea of understanding that there are comparative and absolute advantages in different areas, different regions to different products, and with different countries. So understand what you're dealing with. This is not necessarily the idea of reinventing the wheel. This is the idea of looking at what exists and saying, how can we capitalize upon what exists and or how can we make what exists better? Then we follow into the idea of determining shipping, traffic, and documentation procedures and requirements. In other words, Logistics 101. You must understand the idea of logistics. Understand if it is truly cheaper to sell your product if it has to be shipped halfway around the world than to sell a domestic product in that same culture. If it is, then that is obviously a market that you should look at. But you have to understand it and have the need to be brutally honest in all of these calculations only makes sense. It saves you problems, it saves you issues in the end. Next, promote, sell, and be paid. Simply implement the planning procedures and work the product, work the service. Utilize what you have, what you know about the information and the data that you've gathered. And then finally, as this says, continuously analyze current marketing, economic, and political situations. If that is not your forte in a business organization, albeit perhaps in a small business organization, if that's not your forte, place people around you that understand that. Make sure that you have some people that understand those types of situations. My apologies as I needed to take a break, kind of full of congestion these days. Um, Remember all of those steps when we're looking at the idea of entering markets on the macro level and looking at taking care and properly taking care of markets on the macro level. Now we're going to talk a little bit and analyze some of these separate ideas. First of all, we're going to talk about different types of trade restrictions. It's extremely appropriate for the times as we have looked at some situations with tariffs mainly concerning China, although there are other countries that have been involved in this as well. But a tariff is simply defined as an import duty. It's a tax levied on a particular foreign product entering a country. Now there's two basic types of tariffs. First is a revenue tariff. It's imposed solely to generate income for the government. Second is a protective tariff, which is imposed to protect the domestic industry from competition by keeping the price of the competing, my apologies, imports level with or higher than the price of similar domestic products. In other words, the idea is this: if you produce something at the same level, basic price level in a country, or even cheaper that you are importing to, if they can place a, say, 20% tariff on it, it will make certain that unless you're able to cut expenses further, it will make certain that every single one of those products is more expensive than the domestic product. And the idea, of course, is simple. Whenever you have two competing products, all other things being relatively equal, in other words, price, longevity of use, easeability of use, quality, then price will always be king. You will always go with the cheaper product if that is available to you and you can find it and in fact purchase it. So looking at that, that is the two goals, or those are the two goals of tariffs. Next, dumping. you're looking at the idea of exporting large quantities of a product at a price lower than that of the same product in the home market. You might ask, well, what sense does that make? Because you might not be making a profit. That's true. You might not be making a profit, or you might not be making the profit that you could potentially make on that product. However, by if you are allowed to dump your product or your export into a country, you could quite likely freeze out the domestic market in a situation. Once you do that, your competition becomes less, and you have the opportunity of then perhaps raising prices, hopefully in small incremental amounts that the market will absorb, but raising the prices so you can look at the idea of gaining more profit per piece and having that type of situation. So dumping can be useful. Of course, there are a lot of countries that look to utilize legislation against that, and for good reason. The idea simply becomes that if it's allowed in a country, it can be an effective tool to help gain entry into a market in a rather rapid pace. Excuse me. Next, we have non-tariff barriers. A non-tariff barrier is defined as a non-tax measure imposed by a government to favor domestic over foreign suppliers. This is basically a favoring position only. This is never utilized to make money for the government. It is no kind of revenue tariff in that situation. It is a protective tariff. First of all, import quotas. Those are limits on the amount of a particular good that may be imported into a country during a given period of time. For example, 500,000 units of a particular vehicle coming into the United States from, say, South Korea. The reason for that is if that, even if that vehicle is or does have a high demand, that high demand has the tendency to raise the price as demand typically does concerning a restricted supply, thereby running the price up to where certain amounts of the market may not be able to afford that vehicle, and competitive markets, or those ideas that can be those products that can be substituted in that market, would be utilized in that situation, would be purchased in that situation, because due to the price effect of supply and demand, they will end up costing more. There's also foreign exchange control. It's a restriction on the amount of a particular foreign currency that can be purchased or sold. For many years, there has been an effort to curb the artificial manipulation that China engages in concerning currency. The idea is this: if you can withstand the idea of manipulating currency in that artificial fashion, then you can manipulate prices or worthiness of those in that situation. It depends upon how it's done, but it in fact can be an effective tool. Uh, China has utilized this many times in the past, and it has been arguably effective depending upon the time. Uh, that is one of the huge issues that the United States deals with China, because again, we are one of China's biggest markets. They hold a significant portion of our debt. There is no plausible sense in wanting to throw a wrench in that situation from either end. However, those kinds of things still can happen. For example, this type of manipulation. And so it must be actively combated without looking to close down a market completely. Now, the final type of trade restriction can be simply cultural barriers. And as it says, cultural barriers can impede acceptance of products in foreign countries. Example, illustrations of feet are regarded as despicable in Thailand. Black and white are the colors of mourning in Japan and thus should not be used in packaging. Japanese packaging is typically very colorful, and that is one of the main reasons that it's very colorful, is because black and white represents mourning, and very little or very few products and or advertisements for services would be useful or would be useful to utilize black and white in that situation with what it represents. Now, what are the reasons for trade restrictions? Quite honestly, to equalize a nation's balance of payments. Again, remember the definition of balance of payments. All monies going in and out of a country, not products, not imports and exports, all monies. Some of those monies are recognized and are understood to include, of course, imports and exports and the trade balance. But the payments balance, or the balance of payments, actually includes all monies of any kind. Also, to protect new or weak industries. If an industry is relatively new, the last thing that a country might want to happen would be for a foreign entity to be able to come into that country already established, take a hit, if you will, in with lower prices for a particular length of time in order to force that new industry or that new set of organizations out of business because they simply cannot stand to handle that hit even on a temporary basis, thereby forcing that new industry out or perhaps that weak industry out and being able to have that country regain that competition. To protect national security, yes, sometimes things come down to ideas of national security, perceived and or real. Please understand, perceived and or real. Because the idea is this, if it is perceived to harm national security, it may have the tendency for customers to run away from it. Perfect example of this again is after 9/11, particular types of products and services that were readily identified with the Muslim religion simply were perceived to be national security issues, whether they truly were or not. To protect the health of citizens, again, same reason. We have some of the strongest health and safety regulations as far as business products and services in the world. It is to help protect our citizens. That's part of the reason why it's more expensive, of course, to produce things domestically than it is to produce things in an outsourcing fashion. Because, say, for example, Mexico does not necessarily have the same high safety standards, the same high manufacturing standards. At one point, there was an issue supposedly with certain types of materials that were poisonous in dog food. At one time, the idea of the situation of paint, having lead in the paint, after it was basically looked to be outlawed in the United States, there were countries that were still sending paint into the United States laced with lead. So it makes an issue in that situation. To retaliate for another nation's trade restriction. Yes, nothing more pertinent than that. That's the idea, supposedly, depending upon who you whose opinion you subscribe to, the reason for China's tariffs against the United States. It was a retaliatory measure for some of the tariffs that the United States imposed on Chinese products, and also to protect domestic jobs. Again, looking and going back to the quota system that I explained earlier, absolutely can be utilized to protect domestic jobs. Reason against trade restrictions, higher prices for consumers. It's that simple. Please understand, regardless of what people running around the countryside with their hair on fire may tell you, it is the domestic consumer that pays that tariff every single time. The domestic consumer inside the country that has placed a tariff on a particular product because you either buy lesser quality products and or substitutions and lesser priced and lesser quality if they are available, or you pay the higher price. Either way, you are putting out more money in the long run. If it's a lesser quality and it becomes obsolete quicker, you obviously have to buy more of something, thus having to pay a higher price. If you in fact go ahead and purchase the product that has been imported in the United States at that higher price due to some trade restriction, you're already paying the higher price. Also, restriction of consumers' choices for the very same reason. It may be in a situation, for example, the trade restriction of quota, where you simply don't have the choice because the quota for that particular product has already been sold for this year or this period, whatever that period may be. And you simply don't have any choice to get it, perhaps except for a black market situation. And that could bring about particular penalties. And finally, misallocation of international resources. Absolutely. Again, when we have comparative advantages in situations, if trade restrictions are involved, it has a tendency to artificially manipulate that comparative advantage. Again, the idea should be a global economy where every country produces exactly what they have comparative advantages in. There would be no trade tariffs anywhere. There would be no trade restrictions anywhere. There would not be any need for them. It would simply be a trade system, worldwide global system that's in balance. Now, is that perhaps almost impossible to achieve? Yeah, that's very possible. That's very possible that it is impossible to achieve. But again, that's the goal. And finally, loss of jobs. Because no matter what you're looking at in this situation, there are a lot of jobs tied up in international logistics. Again, we've talked about this before. There's a lot of people, for example, that live in the border state of Texas that work in logistics on the Texas side or go across the border and work in logistics on the Mexican side of the border. If there is a tariff situation or if there is a trade restriction that that artificially changes the market in that way, people simply stand the chance of losing their job. And might it be in the best interest of a particular industry to utilize some of these trade restrictions? Perhaps. But tell that to the person that just lost their $45,000 a year job. And they're not absolutely certain that they can find employment at the same compensation level without having to work two or perhaps three jobs. People always, always, always vote their pocketbook and their wallet. That's something that always has to be remembered concerning anything that's being looked at in business. Again, from the micro level to the macro level. People always vote their pocketbook and their wallet. Again, my apologies. Now, is business growing on the international level? Absolutely. Restrictions or not, international business is growing. The idea is this: human nature states the following: you will not take away nor keep away things that a human being wants on a regular basis. That's part of the issue concerning legalization of medical and or recreational marijuana. That's exactly part of the reason why it happens and why it has happened. It's why prohibition was a failure. Because the bottom line of the situation is this: concerning prohibition, people wanted to drink. They didn't stop drinking. It ushered in or codified, or excuse me, not codified, solidified the idea of organized crime to the point where people finally understood the only people that are getting rich off of this are the people that shouldn't ever in the first place. We have turned them into criminals, and now we're making the criminals rich. Part of the same idea is happening and has happened with marijuana. Now, again, not talking about right, wrong, moral, immoral. I'll leave all of that to your opinion. We're talking about the business, the pure business ideas of these situations. Now, what's the outlook for trade or the economic outlook for trade? Canada and Western Europe, you're looking especially at Canada in the situation with the United States, looking at a very strong situation. The idea is Canada and the United States are two of the most prolific trading partners on the planet. Regardless of things that may happen, dust ups from time to time, if you will, especially political dust ups that may happen from time to time, Canada is one of our best trading partners. We're one of Canada's best trading partners. Again, money talks. Mexico and Latin America, those markets are also growing. Please remember the idea, even when you have situations where you have political unrest and political turmoil in a country, one of the ways to help that, to help end that, is to help stabilize their economy. Looking to make that economy, that local and domestic economy, stable. When people have solid jobs, solid job security, a roof over their head, and a full belly, some things tend to go by the wayside. Now, not everything, but some things tend to go by the wayside. You tend to be a lot less angry when you're satisfied. It's a rather simple concept. Japan, world's third largest economy in the United States, fourth largest trading partner. Look at the situation, folks. It was roughly 75 years ago when World War II ended in 1945. Bitter hatred of Japan. In fact, uh, quite honestly, my father fought in World War II, served in World War II, served in the Korean conflict. He did not have a lot of good things to say in that situation. Fast forward, if you will, 75 years later, and the bottom line of the situation is they're a very vital and necessary trade partner to the United States, as we are to them. And again, it helps with stability in the area. Other Asian countries, as it says, China's grown to be the world's second largest economy. The United States shares more than $500 billion in annual bilateral trade, the largest trading relationship we have. And remember, I said Canada was one of the largest. China is the largest. We're looking at a situation again where it makes sense. It makes sense for both economies. Both economies have the ability to remain relatively stable because of this, even with the turmoils that take place in other economies in the world. Africa is an up and coming situation. Depends upon the country, quite honestly, but it's an up and coming situation. Now, let's talk just a little bit. We won't go into great depth in these because, again, this is something we could spend the entire 8 weeks debating upon. First of all, the worthiness of these particular measures at the time, the worthiness of them in later times, uh, and the overall complex nature of their very being. First, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, known as GATT. It was an international organization of nations dedicated to reducing or eliminating tariffs and other barriers to world trade. This is where the idea came out of most favored nation status. In other words, if you have most favored nation status, you are a favored trading partner. We will have a tendency to look to you for particular products before we will look at nations without this status, even though it may be relatively equal. Or even in some situations, depending upon, again, the need for stability, what you're looking at economic stability within a particular country. So most favored nation status was actively sought after. Now, there are different types of rounds, what they call rounds, the Kennedy round, Tokyo round, and the Uruguay round. Now, what these are best known for are simply things that came into being or went out of being in these rounds and the ideas. I am not as interested in going into that in depth. Uh, the reason being because, again, we could spend a lot of time that unfortunately we don't have analyzing what goes on in these situations. So we'll simply move on. Next idea is the World Trade Organization, or WTO. It was a successor to GATT and incorporated trades in goods, services, and ideas. It was created by the Uruguay round. Looking at the idea of what you are looking at concerning a more efficient or hopefully more effective way of addressing it on a worldwide situation. And quite honestly, it happened because of some of the additions of some countries in this situation and looking at this, hopefully to have a better mechanism for all of this to happen. Now, also the idea came about of economic communities. We won't go into this in a lot of detail because economic communities have a tendency to shift, as is the case with Brexit and the European Union. But the definition of an economic community is an organization of nations formed to promote the free movement of resources and products among its members and to create common economic policies. There are several other economic communities, but the idea is this is an outgrowth of the idea of favored nation status, putting together a community. For example, Um, if you put together this on a micro level, it would be a group of people and or organizations that you would trade with on a regular basis. You would expect uh, better service, for example. You might expect a little bit better price from these types of organizations and these types of communities. Uh, Again, on the micro level and on the macro level, you would expect that it would be a situation where people in these communities, people in these organizations would be the first call concerning particular types of trade. And then if that perhaps did work within that community, then take it outside of the community, look to other areas. Um, this also gives you a better idea of what's coming. It allows you to not necessarily budget expenses, but it allows you to budget what you believe you will be have or you will have coming into a particular business or coming into a particular community, coming into a particular country, so to speak. We look for X amount of trade this year, this fiscal year, whatever the year is defined at. And looking at that situation, then we can go outside of that, knowing we have that base. We could perhaps go outside of that to organizations and or countries, depending upon, again, the level of micro or macro, looking at that situation of bringing in additional forces, additional, again, communities and, or excuse me, organizations and or communities that might not be part of our community at that time that we can convince to come into our community. Again, the goal is perfectly level global trade. This is one way going for larger and larger communities. This is one way for that to potentially happen. Now, the last thing we're looking at is financing. And there are several sources concerning financing of international business. One source, of course, is the United States Small Business Administration. It is, as it's advertised, a small business administration. You're looking up to $5 million. May sound like a lot of money, and it is a lot of money. But on a macro level, it is not that much money. But it can be an initial stepping stone situation in which you can gain financing for your particular type of international business, especially if this is an intro situation on a lower level. Now, you're also looking at the Export Import Bank in the United States. It's an independent agency of the government, and their function, as stated, is to assist in financing the exports of American firms. They are basically an economic cheerleader for American firms worldwide in a global situation, looking to strengthen market presence in countries that a particular organization or a firm is already engaged in, or looking to gain entry into brand new marketplaces. There are also what's known as multilateral development banks. It's simply a supported bank that is supported on the international level that supplies loans to developing countries to help them grow. There are different subsets of this organization. The one that most people have heard of is the World Bank, but there's also, as stated, the Inter-American Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the African Development Bank, and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and it is just as advertised. The Asian Development Bank is mainly concerning Asian nations. Also, you may have heard of the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF. It's an international bank that makes short-term loans to developing countries experiencing balance of payment deficits. In other words, again, this is the same idea as the credit card idea. If all you ever can pay is a minimum payment on a credit card situation, then it's likely that you will never be out of debt. Well, when this happens on the micro level, it does not leave, nor does it afford money to grow a country's economy. So it looks like the idea that you're talking about in this situation is once third world, always third world. Without organizations such as this and without some loan forgiveness matters that people like Bono champion, that's exactly what would happen. They would remain in that status forever. And again, that is not the goal. All right, that wraps up everything. Uh, Again, please understand this will be posted. A link will be sent to you. Uh, if you ask one question, at least one question, you can of course ask more, but if you ask at least one question, you will gain extra credit points. Please remember to send that question to me in the form of an email. Thank you, and see you in class next Monday.